Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening as you're signing in for the CCS Donor Lifetime Value webinar. I'm Greg Hagin, Principal Managing Director with CCS, and we're absolutely delighted that you've decided to spend your time with us at this point for the next 45 to 60 minutes. We have a terrific program in store for everybody. I'm going to start with some introductions, a little bit about the firm and Dr. Ashutosh Nandeshwar and Dr. and Professor Peter Fader. And we're going to talk briefly about today's philanthropic landscape, some of the factors and forces that are affecting giving and fundraising. The main topic, as we can see here, is really donor lifetime value, getting a better sense of what does that mean? How do we define DLV or donor lifetime value? What it doesn't mean, what some misconceptions might be, and really how it is a pretty common for-profit or customer term in terms of CLV, customer lifetime value, but how do we apply it on the philanthropic side to raise additional and significant philanthropic capital? And then the main event is really to open this up for a panel discussion, followed by your comments, your best thinking, and your questions around this topic, and naturally the application thereof. So just as we keep going here, again, on the next slide, just for introductions, Greg Kagan, Senior Partner on our Board of Directors at CCS Fundraising, been in the business for several decades at this point, and really privileged to welcome Ashutosh, who will introduce himself momentarily, and Peter as well as we engage in that conversation with Pete, co-founder and director at Theta, distinguished professor at the Wharton School. So as we keep moving here, just to think about today's philanthropic landscape, and this has been a bit of common knowledge for just a couple of months at this point, and CCS did unveil our own version of today's philanthropic landscape. And just for what it's worth, we will have a new publication out later this month that we're excited to release, and we look forward to thoughts and comments and feedback. But as you'll note here, the most recent giving results top nearly just shy of $600 billion in the US, which is pretty remarkable. And we've tracked this, of course, over the last 40 or 50 years. And it is interesting that despite what is happening in the world, and that all affects things of the economy and politics and war and famine and forces and new technologies, that giving is reliable and is resilient. So we want to start with that frame. We also want to talk about some of the other factors here and some of the other conditions, and really some of the fundamentals that we see associated with philanthropy. And this is probably common knowledge for all of us, but just to set the table before we get into donor lifetime value itself, that there is a generous spirit and people are responding not just to a cause, but those who are champions for a cause and in relation to the person who is asking. We see this as truly a timeless principle over and over and over again. That when there's a connection, an authentic connection, when there's an emotional relationship, we definitely see giving increasing, and where there's a definable impact or outcome or measurement associated with the giving. As we look to the next slide, you'll notice that, and I don't think that this is a new experience for any of us, to the extent that there's always going to be these factors and forces that are going to have an influence on today's giving terrain. We know that there are politics at play, certainly this year in particular. There are different power shifts around the world and realities and perceptions and certain American theaters of our place in the world. There's economic fluctuations and a degree of uncertainty, whether it's because of the tariffs or the trade wars or just the way capital flows are moving. But navigating inflation, are we looking for full employment? Are we looking for a stable cost range or a price range as dictated by the Fed? AI is certainly a consideration. We've gone from traditional to modern to now agentic AI. So it's not just algorithms anymore, but it's which agents are going to fill some of the boxes in the org charts. And all this in this environment of radical uncertainty. And all that is equally true, that giving is resilient and powerful and reliable, and these factors and forces are at play. Just to keep going here for a minute, We'll also notice that giving is highly concentrated. And in so many ways, this is an outcome, a derivative, a reflection of wealth creation and distribution in society. It's also following a simple mathematical principle, the Pareto principle, and it applies to so many different things, whether it's real estate or art or athletics or different industries. But roughly 20% of households are responsible for nearly just over 80% of all giving. But the interesting piece starts to get a little bit more interesting within this pyramid, is that that pyramid starts to look more and more like an Eiffel Tower, and that 1% of households are responsible for nearly 50%. So it's a concentrated segment that we see here. The next slide, we just wanted to illustrate a number of things that, yes, individual giving is resilient, it is robust, but in terms of the composition over this 40-year stretch, it is closing, it is reducing a little bit from 80% down to 67%. Now, fortunately, other aspects, other segments are increasing. We see with corporations and foundations in particular, certainly donor advisor funds or different styles of contribution or platforms. And naturally, we're expecting this intergenerational wealth transfer when we think about the next 15 to 25 years. So that's also a factor to keep in mind. Just on the next slide, to keep us going here, this is one of the concepts we've been thinking about quite a bit. And this is really where we'll lean into the conversation in just a minute. We see DLV, or donor lifetime value, the study of it, the analysis, and its application can unlock incredible opportunity. And oftentimes at CCS, as a strategy consulting and fundraising management firm, widely recognized throughout the sector, we'll say, okay, in that top end, that echelon of the pyramid, can we play out different forecasts or simulations, Monte Carlo simulations statistically? In addition to that, is there an opportunity through predictive analytics to build different models that look at major donor patterns, or maybe look at annualized gifts, or maybe think about plan gifts for the long haul? But what studies can we consider that will then influence future behaviors of that nature? On the other side of that, beyond individuals, also corporations and foundations, and where is the opportunity analysis there? Throughout this pyramid, you can see donor lifetime value at the bottom here. And what I think is really important is not just the recency, but also the frequency and the monetary value, and what is at risk. What would be the opportunity cost or the trade-off if there was certain donors, certain segments that were at risk? There are some years, but not all years, last year, but not this year. So DLV attempts to look at that, to funnel up and create the next major donors and the next big givers to campaigns and other massive projects. The final slide that I'll just focus on here and then really hand it off to Ashutosh is, when we think about DLV, in so many ways, it can help identify and guide donor journeys. And one of the ways that we consider this is within the first 3 years of a donor commitment or relationship with a nonprofit. And you can see here that 20% of people who convert to a major gift in less than 3 years, they didn't start at the most robust level. Maybe it was a starter gift, maybe it was a pathway gift, maybe it was at an event, maybe because a friend asked, or it was in response to a mailing. But by a focus where there's both inclination and capacity, we can guide, or we can better advise that journey going forward. And you'll notice, even in the aggregate, it's important to remember that great stewardship has a cumulative effect. So this DLV really consideration and construct is especially important in today's fundraising terrain and giving scape. So with that said, Ashutosh, hopefully that's setting the table for your commentary here, and would love to hear more from your view about DLV overall. Ashu, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. As you mentioned, my name is Ashutosh Nandeshwar, and I lead the data science and analytics practice area at CCS. My team and I work with various sectors, clients, to uncover fundraising potential. And as Greg walked us through a couple of examples how we are able to understand and uncover this potential, and as well as find more ways to become more efficient. Just quick introduction of my background and training is in machine learning and design thinking. I have written a couple of books, including Data Science for Fundraising, and really excited to share some ideas with you here today. And before we jump into the discussion, as Greg mentioned, we have been at CCS thinking about donor lifetime value and predictive models for some time now. And Greg shared the pyramid where small number of donors account for most of the giving. In some cases, the top 1% actually are responsible for close to 80 to 90% of the total fundraising. But did you know that close to that 1% of the population, about 50% of them stop giving after 6 years? So think about for that a minute. There are two factors that are happening here. One is a small percentage of donor population is giving the majority of the giving, but then out of those, that top population, 50% of the donors are lost within the next 6 years, 5 to 6 years. So what does that mean? If we keep losing this large population of these top donors, how do we keep finding new donors and set the right goals? And this is where, as Greg mentioned, donor lifetime value and predictive models can be really helpful. With DLV and predictive models, we can make smarter decisions. What are some of those examples? We can use techniques, as Greg highlighted, Monte Carlo forecasting, to help come up with different scenarios that can help us set goals, whether those are annual goals or goals for major campaigns. We can also build some forecasting models to establish the baseline. And also, again, as Greg highlighted, the foundation analysis to understand the opportunity not only from the individual donors, but also the institutional donors. So when you combine all of these different things, we are able to make really good decisions and data-driven decisions. And when we think about increasing the donor lifetime value, there are a couple of things that are happening here. Donor lifetime value itself as a predictive technique can help uncover the value, the scores. But when you think about, as Greg highlighted in that chart, when we think about whether donors started just giving 3 years ago or they have been giving for 20 years, we can use those principles to increase the overall compounding donor lifetime value. And how do we do so? There are a couple of things that we can do. One is we can not only use predictive models to identify the high potential major donors, we can also use DLV plus the combination of predictive models to understand which engagement strategies, priorities are actually driving the most of the results and what activities are giving us better ROI. And this analysis with the advanced modeling can help us plan for better resource allocation as well as investments. And DLV really offers us a neutral measure for comparing different engagement activities. Without that, we really don't have a good solid measure to see which activities are yielding better results. So when we combine all these different approaches, we can keep our donors engaged and increase their overall contribution levels. And lastly, when we think about using these frameworks, ultimately what happens is we increase the fundraising efficiency. And it happens because of a couple of reasons. Rather than trying to guess or create ad hoc segmentations, we can actually use these predictive values and these models and these approaches to understand different segmentation, different segments. For example, one segment is at-risk donors. Do we know who we would lose in the next few years? These models can help us think about that. And then again, going back to the strategies of cultivation and engagement, we can think about different strategies. Same thing with upgrade. What if we knew which prospects were very likely to upgrade? And then maybe based upon that, we can tweak our segmentation strategy as well as our engagement strategy, and then also how we are doing our solicitation. All of those things can be addressed through these predictive values. And then lastly, when we think about gift officer portfolios, this is where, again, lots of the major giving definitely is focused on, is identifying, do we have the right strategies for the gift officers that are at the organization? Are we thinking about this holistically? And these scores and these values help us think about not only the existing folks, existing prospects in these portfolios, but also help us think about new portfolios that we can create based on these values. So when we do all of these different things, we again make smarter decisions. We are able to increase the own lifetime value, and we are able to boost fundraising efficiency. And now there is plenty of information on the internet, including my book on data science for fundraising. Peter has lots of documentation on how you can build some of these donor lifetime value models. So there is lots of information out there. But if you're looking for expertise in this area and seeing how the latest models and techniques and approaches can be applied, CCS offers this product called Seeker Plus to again help you make smarter decisions increase donor lifetime value, and boost fundraising efficiency through the examples that we saw earlier. If you want to learn more, please scan the QR code and it will take you to the information page with all these talking points there. But with that, I will hand it back to Greg to guide us through the next conversation. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you for going through that and explaining that great and new, I would say, novel solution that you just went through with Seeker Plus. There he is, Peter Fader. It's great to have you with us for this conversation today. A brief introduction, and then Pete and Ashu will get right into it. So, Ashu, you had your introduction I offered before, but Pete, we were very honored to have this conversation and excited about this discussion with you. Peter Fader is co-founder and director at Theta, as we've noted before, also distinguished professor of marketing at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He's considered by many, including myself, to be the world famous expert on development and application of models related to customer lifetime value. Many awards on his research and teaching on the topics. Pete, you have 2 or 3 books, probably in counting at this point. Customer centricity would be one of them. Focus on the right customers for strategic advantage. The customer centricity playbook, the customer base audit, many others, global conversations on these topics. Dan McCarthy, I believe, is your co-founder at Theta as well. The two of you have created this customer-based corporate valuation methodology. I think one of your companies was acquired by Nike, if I'm not mistaken. So kudos to you on that success. And you also receive your PhD from MIT, Sloan School of Management. And do I have this right? 2 earlier degrees from MIT as well. So all 3 MIT degrees, that's probably saying something as well. Pete, delighted to have you with us. Thank you for joining the conversation today.
I am so glad to be with you. And I love talking about lifetime value, and it's very hard to find a better domain where these models work, where they make a big difference, and you can really see and measure the impact of them.
That's great. Well, thank you again. So, Pete and Ashu, I think we're going to have a conversation for maybe 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. And then, Ashutosh, we are going to be fielding some questions. I think the chat is lighting up as well. And Pete, why don't I start off with you for this one? We have about 1,000 individuals and nonprofit leaders and fundraisers, executives, trustees, donors who are on the line with us. Maybe you could bring us back for a moment and talk to us a little bit about what is customer lifetime value and what have you learned about that concept in your research and in practice?
So just in terms of a pure definition, it's fairly simple. It doesn't convey the full richness of it, but it's going to be the present value of just all of the good things. We could think dollars and cents, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. That a customer is going to bring us over their lifetime. We can do it over a shorter horizon. We can do it on total contributions or revenue instead of profitability. So there's a lot of different ways of implementing it, but it's just how valuable is each customer. We know that they're very different from each other. We understand this in the nonprofit domain, but it's bringing very sharp, very accurate quantification to that all-important notion.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that, Pete. And you've seen it across industries, different sectors. Maybe go a little bit deeper on the nonprofit side. Do you see it as a seamless application? Are there distinctions when you think about there's CLV, there's DLV? Is the customer the same as the donor, or is there nuance there, whether it's in calculation or strategy and outreach? How do you think about that?
Like I said at the outset, it's a wonderful. Put this way, some of the most influential papers that I've written on CLV have been in the nonprofit space because the data tends to be so clean, because the differences across donors tend to be so vast and so important that it really is just not just a leading edge way to develop and apply these methods, but it's just a living, breathing case study that I want every other sector, whether it's consumer facing, B2B, or even other areas where we're not talking about money necessarily. So to give you a short answer, it's a very clean area to kind of take these methods and just bring them to life quite seamlessly and quite impactfully.
Yeah, it's helpful to hear. Maybe we could drill down on the metric itself, right? I mean, there's so many different key performance indicators and success factors and different metrics, and we could study this number and this calculation and this equation. But why is this one, DLV, maybe first to Peter and then Ashutosh over to you? Why is this metric particularly effective when we think about growth and sustainability?
Well, first, at the highest level, we understand that our donors differ from each other. We understand that some should be getting special treatment and others, it's great to have you with us, but, don't expect the VIP pass that she's getting. That's just the reality of it. This is a sector that's been quite bold, quite unafraid to kind of sort folks out, unlike many of other industries. So you get that. And so just to be able to put specific numbers against donors to understand what they're really worth and what's the ROI on different kinds of outreach efforts. But also, you talk about metrics. If we go one level down, the submetrics of CLV or DLV sometimes are even more impactful. So CLV arises from just three different behaviors. So one is, how long is this relationship going to last? Is this person just going to give us one gift and then go away forever? Or are they going to be kind of a steady but light long-term donor? You understand the difference there, just understanding the length of the lifetime. Number two, how frequently? You mentioned frequency. Will they participate over that lifetime? And what is it that what we do to kind of get them to act on things a little bit more? And number three, how much value are we getting every time they do a thing? How much are they spending? How much time are they spending? How many people are they referring? So however we define value, it's just the amount of value that's created when they interact with us. Those three subcomponents, which I like to think about as retention, repeat purchase, and spend, are super interesting, super important, and lifetime value is nothing more than the combination of all of them together.
Mm. It's really helpful to hear. Ashutosh, how do you think about that? And maybe acknowledge or respond to Pete's response. And then altogether, how are you thinking about growth and sustainability through DLV?
Yeah, building upon Pete's excellent comments around retention, frequency, when we think about increasing revenue, essentially we have three levers. One is retention, another is acquisition, and third is upgrades. These are for-profit terms, but they do apply to our industry as well and our sector. When we think about retention, can we retain most of those donors? As we shared in the previous slides, if we keep losing them, then that's a big problem because that's a big leaky bucket and we need to stop that. So DLV can help us, predictive models can help us understand where that leaky bucket is and what are those approaches that we can take. When we think about upgrades, again, predictive models, DLV, advanced machine learning are suitable to understand where that could be and how we can upgrade some of those donors. So that helps us with the growth as well. So not only sustainability with the retention issue, but growth with some of these upgrades. Acquisition is a slightly trickier problem because obviously ROI is typically low on acquisition, but again, we can use DLV and predictive modeling, machine learning, and some clustering and personification to understand where we might be able to target to get newer donors so that again, it's filling with our sustainability problem and we have a good pipeline of new prospects.
Really good, Ashu. But maybe we could stay on this one or two steps deeper. How, again, on our audience for today, there's a wide variety of sectors and budgets and positions. But what are some of the top ways? And Ashu, you mentioned that, right, on retention and acquisition, and then there's also upgrade, and that speaks to the funnel illustration that we talked to earlier. But what are some ways that nonprofits could use DLV when you think about strategies and tactics to like actual donor engagement and influencing donor journey? What comes to mind?
Yeah, a couple of approaches. One is when we think about engagement strategies, when we think about events, let's just take events as an example. So much effort goes into organizing an event, thinking about carefully who should be there, who could they bring along with them, and really carefully selecting that 50 to 100-person room. And all that happens, and you're exhausted after the event, and you're saying, okay, this was great. We feel really good, energized, but what does this actually mean? And there is no good way to actually measure that. Of course, we know good stewardship events will ultimately, Greg, as you highlighted earlier, the long-term stewardship is always a good thing to do to be connected with our top donors and volunteers and supporters. But just in strictly mathematical sense, there is no good way to measure that ROI of those events or engagement strategies. Other examples could be you're sending expensive brochures or you're sending emails. How do we know which ones are actually giving us better outcomes? DLV, I believe, is a good neutral measure where we can compare different initiatives, activities, engagement strategies to say, well, we organize this event, we organize this event, organize event A, event B. Can we see the DLV from those donors and attendees and compare them in the 5-year time horizon to see how much money or how much value did they have to contribute to our organization? And then we can evaluate our strategies and come up with maybe new engagement ways to engage these folks.
Let me double click on what Ashu just said. So when you're looking at a particular event, it's not only just what is the overall net present value that we've enhanced through running that event. That's great. I mean, really terrific. It's maybe that should be use case number one. But then we can start to get really granular about it. We can almost flip it around and say, what kinds of events, campaigns, activities, messages are disproportionately appealing to our highest value donors? So instead of just saying which one's got the most people to attend or got the most clicks or likes or whatever, because keep in mind, though, the 80-20 kind of thing, most of our donors are fairly light. So most of those clicks don't really carry a lot of weight. Can we find the words, activities, and messages that are disproportionately appealing to the highest value donors and use that to start to design what the next campaign should look like? In a similar way, a really common strategy in the commercial world would be on the acquisition side, would be lookalike strategies. Like a lot of nonprofits think they understand what the best donors look like, and sometimes they're often thinking about demographics, which you could see my face, not a big fan of. Can we find behavioral indicators? Again, it could be what specific part of the fund did they first donate to? What resonates with those high value donors early on in their philanthropic careers? And let's try to go after donors who resembled them at kind of a young age in terms of their donation history. So we can get really smart, really data driven about which kinds of donors to go after and what are the ROI on those acquisition efforts as well.
Yeah, I like the way, Pete, you brought up the attributes, but behaviorally, what are those characteristics, not just demographics alone, and what are people actually doing? What are they exhibiting early on and the value creation over time? I'm wondering if the two of you could take that a step further as well. So if it's informing strategies by fundraising and engagement, how might we think about investment allocation? So, okay, you have this analysis, you know where the opportunity is. How might that provoke or inspire or motivate arguments to say, hey, we should be investing more in general, or we should be investing more in these targeted areas because they're going to have better returns over time? How do the two of you think about it from a budgetary perspective?
Go ahead, Ashu.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. When we think about, again, going back to the long-term stewardship, Greg, the point that you made, if donors start really small, strictly in dollar cents, you would say, well, why should we be investing in these initiatives if it's not going to give us those large dollar numbers that we are looking for? But then when you think about, again, the point that Pete, you just made about looking at those attributes earlier in their donation or giving history, what are those attributes? Maybe they did attend some of those events that at that point didn't show any ROI, or maybe the annual giving program that we have been maybe just slightly breaking even. Maybe it's not even exceeding the budget that we allocated for the annual giving programs. I'm just making this up, but I'm saying if that were the case, if you were just to strictly look at the break even number, you would say, well, this activity is actually not worth our investment. But when you think about the longer term horizon, as Pete again highlighted, we can say, well, actually, look, people who either attended these events or were part of these committees or part of these other engagement stewardship things, or they were part of these annual giving appeals early on, they actually tend to have a really higher donor lifetime value. And then you can use that as a calculation to say, well, let's not just look at this year or 2 years from now. Let's look at 5 years from now and invest accordingly.
So a longer time horizon on that. Yeah, Pete, what say you?
Well, just picking up on that, it's funny, my previous answer, I'm getting real micro. Now I want to get real macro. I want to help nonprofits justify spending more money on the three activities that Ashu mentioned, acquisition, retention, and upgrades. Too often, we look at those expenditures as costs. What's it going to cost us to run that event or do some kind of outreach? But if we can look at it in ROI terms, if we look at them truly as investments and know what are we getting from it in the long run, we're going to be able to justify greater budgets. And it's not only going to help us kind of on the marketing side do the things that we like to do, but our friends in finance are going to like the accountability that arises from it. When they see how the dollars are working or which dollars are working most effectively, it's going to be possible to spend more money, get more results. Everybody is better off. And so to move from the short run to the long run, and to move from the gut feel to the financially accountable go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's great in conversation, often between a head of development or a head of finance, a chief development officer, a chief financial officer. There's that discussion with the CEO there. There's the board, and they're all engaging in this conversation. Which dollars, how are those dollars working, and over what time horizon? Peter, I'm wondering if you could also offer a few concrete examples that come to mind, and whether that's a blend, some in the nonprofit space or in an analogous way, what can we learn from the for-profit world, whether it's specific companies or categories or different industries that you've been involved with?
And by the way, this is one of the things that just makes me so happy about what's going on in the sector these days, because it used to be it was only people from the nonprofit world, and it's still predominantly so. But we're getting more and more just, smart, creative people from other domains to bring not only some outside perspective and expertise in, but just a little bit more willingness to take risks and try new things. So now's the time to do it. So some of the examples that I want to give, if I gave them 5, 10 years ago, people would have said, well, that's no good. That's, company XYZ. They apply. I'm telling you, they apply. And if you don't believe me, we'll go down deeper. So a few examples. First, on this whole, ROI investment side, a lot of the work that I've been doing, both the academic work as well as some of the commercial work through Theta, is this idea. Greg, you said the words before, we can't emphasize them strongly enough. Customer-based corporate valuation. So, for instance, we'll have private equity firms coming to us to say, we're thinking about buying this digitally native men's underwear company. What's it actually worth? And instead of viewing it through the usual financial lens, let's project how many customers they're acquiring and how long they're staying and how often they're buying and how much they're spending. Same thing. Add all that up. That's revenue. That's cash flow. That's EBITDA. So we can do a better job of forecast help the CFO do a better job through this marketing lens. That's tremendous. And even if you're not worried about exactly which donors to go after and what are the characteristics of the campaign, even if you simply want to look at the amount of money we're bringing in and are we still bringing in the same in the future, these techniques are useful right there. But then all the way at the other end of the spectrum, trying to figure out, again, the characteristics of campaigns. I'll give you just a couple of examples. One would be Electronic Arts, the gaming company. So some of you love Sim City or FIFA World Cup. Tremendous users of these models to do pretty much everything. So for instance, they're launching a new game like Battlefield 7. Can't believe I'm talking to a bunch of nonprofit people about some, shoot 'em up game or whatever. But that's my point, is that there are connections here. They don't have an ad agency that's just coming up with kind of clever copy. They're looking at which players are playing the game most and have elevated their own lifetime value and say, what is different about them? Which weapons do they like? What scenes do they favor disproportionately more than other players? Let's build ads around that. So the stuff can be very, very tactical as well as very broadly strategic. And it's great to not only have a broad array of use cases like that, but the fact that we can tie together the tactical and the strategic with a single set of models and metrics can help bring organizational alignment and remove some of the politics that often take place.
Yeah, it's helpful to hear, Pete. Ashu, maybe over to you on this. Any examples that you want to cite, whether it's by name or category or sector, that you found this to be particularly useful for? And then related to that, can you help us understand, yes, there's donor lifetime value in the DLV evaluation itself, that kind of analysis. How does that fit into the overall and comprehensive opportunity analysis that I displayed earlier with the pyramid? Are they together? Can they be done separately? How do you think about that?
Yeah, by way of actually going to that pyramid example, Greg, that you showed earlier, that offers examples of how DLV can be part of our overall analysis. And we can share a couple of examples also how we have done this in the past. But that overall comprehensive analysis is so good because we are able to, as you showed, at the top of the pyramid, those gifts are very hard to predict, but we can use techniques such as Monte Carlo based on some of the indications. Maybe it's the proposal data. Maybe there is some internal knowledge that the gift officers, the development officers have. We can use those techniques to predict what that range might look like at the top. Because again, prediction at that level is really hard. Those are all outliers. But then in the middle of the pyramid, we know, as to Pete's earlier points, we know what those attributes are. We can create those lookalike models, and we can say, we should be going after maybe these prospects, or maybe we should be upgrading these prospects. And then that gives us a sense of what the potential fundraising potential and opportunity there is. Same thing as you highlighted with the foundation piece. Typically, when we are building predictive models, we don't look at institutional donors, but we have a way of analyzing that as well. And then lastly, with donor lifetime value, not only can, as we have been discussing, not only can it help with the annual giving levels at the base of the pyramid, but we can use those same principles to keep upgrading everybody and keep paying attention to the at-risk population, rethinking our engagement strategies. So this comprehensive analysis, along with some of the baseline modeling that we can do to understand what those revenue projections look like for the next 3 to 5 years, you can compare, contrast different activities, different strategies, and come up with a really solid plan to say, here are 5 things we must do. Here are 3 things we should stop doing so that we can improve our baseline performance, say from 20 million per year to 80 million per year. And this is the path. And you can see all of that in very clear writing in numbers and graphs and charts and tables where that opportunity is and what those tactics required. So a couple of examples I can give. We have helped a couple of membership driven organizations where maybe they rely on new members. This is going back to the acquisition question. Obviously, they are self-selecting, they're raising their hand by buying that membership. But what if they're a new member? How do we know what their donor lifetime value is going to be in long term? We could use these methods, these techniques to evaluate that and say, okay, these members maybe have higher value because this was the channel. To again, going back to Pete's point, they were sourced through this channel. Or maybe the cohort. I know, Pete, that's one of the things that you do often, which is cohorts. Did they come in 2020? Did they come in 2025? So that's going to be that's going to be very different for those populations. So again, we can help lots of different organizations. Another sector could be with grateful patients, similar examples where we have new patients coming in. How do we understand their long-term value, and can we quickly identify them? So we have done those projects also to identify what that total fundraising potential looks like and what, again, those activation strategies could be.
Can I
That's
quickly
great.
double click on
Yeah, of
the
course.
cohort thing? I can't believe I've been talking this long without saying the C word that Asha
Seasonality of
just did.
cohort, but cohort.
Cohorts.
Yeah.
That's really, really important, not just to look at your overall donor base as a whole, but to break them out, exactly as Ashu said, based on acquisition cohorts. Let's see what's going on with the folks that we first acquired, who made their first donation in 2021 versus 22 versus 23 versus 24. You'll see some really interesting patterns there. Your cohorts tend to get a little worse. It's not your fault. It's not that you're doing anything wrong, but the best donors are the ones lining up early to jump on board. Later on, you're scraping the barrel. They're not going to be as good. It's very important for you to anticipate what those next cohorts are likely going to look like even before you acquire them. Because if we want to be able to come up with some kind of ROI analysis, we got to know what the baseline is. So if we're out there doing new kinds of campaigns, greater levels of spending, we got to say, well, what are we going to compare it to? We don't want to compare it to last year's cohorts. That's ancient history. We got to compare it to what our historical projections of cohort declines would suggest for 2026 and 2027. So very important to doing these analyses cohort by cohort to see how things are changing and to be able to fine tune the spending to try to, minimize those declines.
Thanks for emphasizing that, Pete. We're going to hand it over to, I think John Samasashi was also going to help with us with some of the questions that have been submitted through the chat and channeled otherwise. But just one last question. Pete, you mentioned this before about return on investment and specifically how and when and where. Any other advice that Pete and Ashutosh you would offer about how can our friends and participants here today be better champions for donor lifetime value at their organization? And then just more broadly, any overarching guidance that you would offer to our nonprofit friends and development leaders as they're navigating today's landscape amidst, in particular, new technology solutions, artificial intelligence, and of course, what we've been discussing here today.
So I'll offer this. I could offer 50 points, but in the interest of time, I'll offer three. One is to start small. Too often I'll work with an organization, I'll just hang a big banner saying it's all about CLV or DLV now. That's going to lead to just a resistance, backlash. So start small. Take either one chunk of the donor base or one kind of campaign activity. And let's just kind of work on it alone and show it, the ROI calculation, show how we can improve them by making small changes. So start small, run experiments, not only to see what works in terms of the data and the models, but what works in terms of the internal corporate culture. So there's number one. Number two, you get what you pay for. There's a bunch of people in the Q&A saying, how do we do the calculations? And I spent my career trying to, onboard people with quick and dirty methods. And I actually regret some of that. At some point, when you're ready for it, you want to do it the right way. You want to use both the leading edge methodologies as well as the leading edge execution of those methodologies and integration of them. This is why I love working with CCS. And number three, I forgot, but you've heard too much from me anyway.
This is on point number two, and prior to that, number one. Ashu, what do you think?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think for folks who are listening right now, or maybe who will get the recording, when we think about, I like Pete's point about starting small and experimenting. But then when the individuals in the teams themselves are thinking about whether, Greg, as you asked the question earlier, when they're thinking of making the case for investments, or maybe they think they're understaffed, especially when we think about stewardship activities. We know stewardship matters, those touch points matter. And usually there's, again, not a good measure to show overall performance and the ROI. I think, again, folks who are listening and maybe get the recording, if you're in those teams, you should definitely think about, okay, can I use donor lifetime value? Can I use some of these predictive models to create these deep level analysis to make a case for more staffing or to show the overall impact of their existing engagement strategies? I would think that would be a lower barrier to entry because, again, the use cases are right there. We are trying to say that these activities will yield into better stewardship. Let's start there.
That's great. Thank you both very, very much. Hopefully, we still have another 15 minutes or so. Ashutosh, would you like to help lead us out? I know we've been fielding questions behind the scenes. Pete was talking about some of the math that was coming in the chat, but Ashutosh, anything you want to serve up first from John?
Yeah, Greg, maybe you can answer this question. This is something around that top 1% or that the shape of the pyramid. How do we think about the risk in that where that population is either getting smaller or the shape is getting squeezed more and more? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an involved question. I think that there are a few different ways to answer it, and I will attempt to engage in a couple of them. And then Ashutosh and Pete would definitely like your opinions on this. So there is that reality. I think that's the first thing to say. Just observe what is actually happening, whether it should be happening or might have been happening a different way or could have happened. But the fact that that top 1% is giving the 50% and the shape of that pyramid, that it oftentimes is a reflection of our democratic, capitalistic, perfect system of wealth creation, of value creation, and the wealthy are getting wealthier. I mean, even if you look at some of the markets, the stock markets and private equity markets, over the last 5 years, many people who are wealthy are doubly wealthy at this time 5 years later. And I think that's a reality that we're dealing with, whether it's income based or usually asset based. There was a book years ago, The Millionaire Next Door, and the stat was something like less than 10% of their total wealth is derived from income because it's all asset based and asset appreciation. So the reason I say that to start is I think it's important to continue to engage there because that populace or that cohort in and of its own way, in a different way than you're describing, Pete, is usually very wealthy, but also has inclination and a philanthropic propensity to give. So it's important to keep engaging, to keep stewarding, and increase their own donor lifetime value from a first gift to a retained gift to an upgraded gift, a major gift, and then a legacy gift. So they see that as their total legacy contribution. The second point I would just make on this briefly is it can't be at the neglect of the rest of the field or the rest of the pyramid or the next opportunity. Pete, to your point about cohorting, every next cohort, right? You got to find what is the next thing, what is the next donor pattern, what is the next behavior, and keeping the message of the philanthropic value proposition both sharp and relevant to the times and the moment. That's kind
In
of how
fact,
I think about that.
I want to add one other point. Actually, from the question, the key word that I saw inside that question is risk. And one of the cool things about these formal models that I'm referring to is not only can we calculate the expectation of how many donations you're going to make in today's present value dollars, but we can also calculate the variability of that. So we could start to make deliberate decisions to not necessarily go after only the highest value donors because they might be very, very, very risky. But let's find that exactly right risk reward trade off. Maybe these people give a little bit less, but they're more steady and reliable. We can quantify the risk as well as we can quantify the returns. So it's really important to be able to do that and to ask the question, is it the case that the donor pool is taking on more risk, as the question implies? Let's find out if that's really true or not, and again, if the returns are worth it.
I think that's really helpful. And Ashi, you might have one. I was also noticing a question here that I thought was intriguing, maybe for you and for Peter, about can DLV be used to leverage scale in a personalized way? So I don't know if we're combining two different concepts here, but Ashutosh, we've often talked about this. How do we create a population of one or a donor segment of one or N equals one at a massive scale? And is there a tension point there? We were talking about this at the Brookings Institution last week in DC between full authenticity and automation. How do you get authenticity donor one at scale? How do you see that relevant to today's conversation?
Yeah, thank you for the question, whoever asked this question. Really good question. And this also connects to the earlier discussion, which is that top 1%, the risk, and are we focusing on only fewer people, not everybody? What is the messaging? And why are we seeing drop off in the donor participation? Is it the messaging? Is it the economical situations or what all those factors might be that Greg, you highlighted earlier? My hunch is that it is with the engagement, that they either don't know about the organization enough that they feel that they should keep participating, or maybe the organizations are not educating their champions enough so that they continue to feel engaged. And this is where maybe at scale, some of these things and combination of DLV or automation with generative AI techniques could be helpful to think about what is that message that someone likes to hear. One of the examples that I like to give often is I worked in higher education for a long time before joining CCS, and higher education tends to always mail you based on your graduation department. So if you graduate from economics, you will keep hearing about economics from the chair, the dean, everybody for the next 25 to 30 years. There is never maybe a particular mailing that or appeal or some sort of communication that is maybe based on your interests, which might be AI. So how do we get to that point, and how do we combine that with the DLV to not only identify which type of messaging would resonate well, but then also what is the content? Can we again get better at that? I think there is a way, But Greg, you mentioned the tension between authenticity and automation. Are we at risk of over-automating so that we lose the whole purpose why we are doing this? Because we do want to make these donors feel better engaged. But then if you're not doing anything, then obviously it might be a better approach to do something rather than not do anything and risk alienating them further.
That's great.
I see a whole
Ashu,
swath of questions, which warms my heart about the
yeah.
Yeah, one
calculations
question.
themselves. Oh, go ahead, Ashu.
Yeah, one question for you, Pete, if you can. So there are two questions here. Maybe we can combine both of those questions. You asked earlier, or you answered a little bit, how can we do this ourselves? What are the best practices? But a question that we can tie with it is a very specific one. What about folks, donors, prospects who are maybe slightly older, say 75 plus? Their lifetime, how do we define their lifetime? And because that might mean different things.
So let me first give the general statement about the calculations. It just so happens that I did a webinar just a couple of weeks ago on kind of machine learning meets CLV better together or something like that. Just so happens that the example that I had as the heart of it just happened to be a nonprofit example. Just to show you that I'm not a nonprofit guy, I'm just a data guy, but there's great data. So I will actually share a link to that webinar with the CCS crew. Anyone can contact me directly as well, but better go through CCS. Don't trust me. And they could share that with anyone who's interested. I think you'll find it's a tiny bit technical, but it will lay out the basic kinds of models that we use, as well as how we layer in the different ML and show you in a nonprofit settings. That's number one. Number two, very often we'll see that the same problem even when we're talking about CLV, which is products that are being aimed at older people or products that are being aimed at younger people. Let's say diapers that they will grow out of in a few years, we hope. And so it's a couple of things on that. Number one, most of your customers, most of your donors are fairly light buyers. Doesn't really matter how old they are, because that next donation they give you will probably be the last one. Not because they're, falling off the face of the earth, but they're going to get distracted with something else. So the first thing, my first answer is don't worry about it. If someone's 75 years old, they still have a lifespan of 5 to 10 years, they'll probably drop out as a donor before, the Father Time gets them. So I don't worry too much about that. It's still a fairly long horizon, and there's still tremendous heterogeneity across those donors. But it is very possible for us to bring in some of those factors, literally bring in the actuarial tables to say what's the probability you'll still be doing stuff with us, 15 years from now. Again, we'll do that quite frequently, and we can use that to guide our acquisition decisions as well. That you might have the right characteristics, you're given the right kind of donation, you're responding to the right kind of campaign, but the actuarial tables are against you, and so your expected lifetime value is going to be lower as a result. So we can fully account for that, but it's not necessarily quite as critical as you might think.
Thanks for sharing, Pete. We have about 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering two last final questions, just kind of lightning round back and forth. Asha, I was struck by this one question. Is there an ideal breakdown of revenue generated? Because you talked about these three of retention, of acquisition, and upgrade. And really the order would be, can we acquire the donor? Can we retain them and then upgrade them? But do you have thoughts on that about both the return and the investment? How much do we allocate into that? How much do we expect on the other side? So just maybe you could think about how you'd want to answer that. And then as almost an outro closing statement or summary guidance from the two of you, what would you advise on tangible, practical, granular next steps? What can people do starting at 4 p.m. Eastern right after this call? But Ashu, over to you first, maybe with those two questions. And then Pete, if you want to help close us out.
We really have to answer that question, whether there's an ideal breakdown. I don't think there is an ideal breakdown. It really depends on the organization and the state and the timeline of the organization. If the organization has just started out in the last 3 to 4 years, then their equation is going to look very different from a mature organization where they have to go back to the earlier questions that we talked about, the sustainability and the growth. That's going to look different for them. One of the things that we could think about is when we think about pipeline. We often say that it takes maybe 18 to 22 months for a major gift to convert from point of identification to actual solicitation and cultivation, then could we use that as a measure to say, okay, how many prospects do we need every N number of months? Which could mean that your portfolio, if you think of from a portfolio perspective, then that means that maybe 25% of your portfolio should be focused on acquisition. Maybe 25 to 35% of your focus should be on solicitation and cultivation. And maybe the 10 to 15% should be focused on stewardship. And then you can keep expanding that to the overall organization. And again, depending on where the organization itself is, we could think about, well, right now we're just growing, so we need to focus a lot on acquisition. What are our acquisition strategies? Some of the examples that Pete mentioned, I mentioned, lookalike models, predictive models, or maybe your organization is really thinking about converting those large gifts from maybe mid-sized gifts. Then your focus should be on cultivation and as well as solicitation strategies, really thinking about what the prospect is interested in, cataloging all the opportunities that we have at our organization, and creating a nice connection for the donor so that we are again being donor centric. So I would think about the organization state, take a deep dive, really analyze what all that means for the organization, and then think about the strategies as the analysis tells us to.
And I'm going to be bold here. Ashu gives you the right answer. I'm going to give you the bold one. At the margin, if you have that one extra dollar to spend on acquisition, retention, or upgrades, for most organizations, it's going to be acquisition. As I said before, if you're guiding your campaigns on the basis of cost, as too often happens, or you're guiding them on the basis of short-term results, as too often happens, you're going to be underspending on kind of quality donors. There's gold in them, there hills. You just need the resources to dig and find it. Lifetime value is the shovel. Okay. So that's where that incremental dollar should be spent. And that's also my answer to Greg's other question, which is, where do you start? Start doing some lookalike analyses. Let's find out what behaviorally separates out our best donors, and let's go after other donors like them. And then my final point is be careful about doing this yourself. Look, a lot of smart people on the call, and that's great. But it's really good to have someone holding your hand and shining the light and, handing the shovel to you. An organization like CCS is just going to help you find that gold a lot more quickly and a lot more effectively.
Peter, thank you for saying that and for that encouragement and that endorsement. Ashutosh, of course, appreciate this conversation. I think it's been a lot of fun, guys. It's been filled with some learning, filled with some new insights, and hopefully our audience today also enjoyed the topic in this conversation. So I would just want to close briefly with thanks all around. I think that there's an opportunity here to receive the follow-up and the recording, a QR code, more information about this topic. Each of our contact information is available. We'd be delighted to engage further in this conversation with you all. So on behalf of CCS Fundraising, thank you all very much.